praise to Bob Geldof.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's daunting following Bill Clinton and Muhammad Yunus and their world views. But if you were to sum it up, it comes down to Muhammad's redesign the system. Bill talked about the unstable world, the unequal world, the unsustainable world. The only way out of that is redesign the system. I've taken on the job at this very important gathering, which I didn't think at the beginning would be important. I've taken on the job of being the sort of doom monger. I don't impress like Bill, and I don't inspire like Muhammad. I just piss you off. And some people came up to me last year saying, for God's sake, Bob, it's not as bad as that. Yes, it is. It's terrible. And all generations fail. The English politicians, Enoch Powell said, all political careers end in failure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, all generations fail. And you're looking at several of my generation who've abysmally failed. You start off and you rail against the world, as I did at your age, and you do your thing and you think you're doing it for the best, and you probably are. But it's not that it doesn't come to anything, it's that it's just not enough. Muhammad talked about being lucky to be alive in this new age. In some ways, yes. In other ways, I think you face far more daunting challenges than his generation or mine. He talked about the Soviet Union and the Cold War, that dismal period of history when we were mutually assured of destruction. And that's what kept the peace. We would destroy each other unless we remained in our barracks and stayed quiet. Well, we are going through what I believe is an historic period of transition in the world, a sort of global rebalancing. This period of transition from the world we know to one we can't yet map. And in that world is utter confusion. And we are deeply confused. Now, behind me are people who can take apart the system as it is and say, that's wrong, I think this is how you fix it. They speak from expertise and profound experience. They're probably right. It's well worth listening to. But this is at the micro level. What we're suffering from in a period of transition, and indeed in every historic period of transition, is a chronic lack of leadership. Now, when the world emerged from that tyrannical, suicidal, murderous 20th century, and particularly at the end of the Second World War, there was clearly one global leader. The rest of the world was bankrupt and in ruins, and that was the United States. That brought a period of extended peace and global institutions that we all more or less had to adhere to because the singular economy was this country. That's not so anymore. And the current argument in this country that you see played out now tonight on your television screens while you're staying here or in your newspapers is essentially being played out around the rest of the world. There can't be, thank God really, one senior and singular power in this age of transition. It isn't even two. It isn't even the balance between China and America, the great creditor nation and the great debtor nation. And this happened, as Muhammad said, in the blink of an eye. In 1980, America was by far the world's greatest creditor nation. By 1987, 7 years later, it was the world's largest debtor nation. And this was the point where you began to see things change. Bill Clinton had it on his desk famously as president. It's the economy, stupid. It's the central argument in this presidential election. But it goes to a more fundamental point in this country. The actual argument is, what is government? What's it for? What's it supposed to do? And it articulates itself in a very basic, primeval form of politics. And that does mirror the rest of the world. And the flux within all your individual countries mirrors exactly the debate here as well. So how does the world break down? If it's not the G1, the United States, if it's not the G2, China, America, the G7 is useless. It's a post-war institution of the victors, and it had its moment when those 7 countries were the dominant economies, and they could make the rules. The G8 is a gift, a sop to the Russians. The G20, for a moment, for one brief hour in its first meeting, it functioned. It no longer functions. And yet, we face global problems, as I pointed out last year, that can only be met by mutual agreement. It is clearly in our global interest that we deal with climate change, sustainability. The essential argument boils down to overpopulation in the developing world, overconsumption in the developed world. That is a zero-sum environmental game. It is unsustainable. The only possible way is cooperation, compromise, and consensus. That must be the political paradigm for the 21st century, because we know the last ruinous century was based on the political paradigm of competition. It won't work. And it's too late for practically everyone here behind me, which means it's your game. Now, Kate and David gave me, and I'm sure the rest of us, a list of what you'd achieved in the last year. And when I was pointing out to you the horrors that we face, I think I ended by saying, go to work. There's some incredibly brave people in this room tonight. Immediately I'm thinking of the 3 girls from Jeddah who had a march of their own, which we can't name because their entire families will come under scrutiny, etc. And it cannot just be about your singular activities. I don't think that's good enough anymore. I think more has to come out of this conference and this meeting. If we're talking about redesigning the system, Mohammed, then there has to be more of a collective effort thinking beyond just your local micro problem, essential as that is. Essential as education clearly is. Going forward into the newer economies that are being developed and the new technologies, it is only education that gets you there. Inequalities need to be eradicated. Will they be? No. We're human. You don't like my haircut, you're not giving me the job, which is why I've been unemployed for most of my life. I don't like where you're from. I don't like your accent. You're a girl, you're a boy. You've got too many kids, you've got not enough. We're a tragic lot. 2 kinds of power determine international politics: the power to force change and the power to resist it. In a leaderless world like now, what's the outlook? I think it's a regional one. I think we'll break down to spheres of influence again. This was the phrase used pre the First World War, and it's been used largely now. The Russians claim their sphere of influence is around the stands and Ukraine. The Europeans, their sphere of influence is all of Europe. The Americans there, the Brazilians there, South Africans and Nigerians there. It'll probably come down to this, and the need to cooperate within that. But there's no real incentive in the leaderless world to cooperate. But if we don't, we have Bill's 3 problems, and we fail to do what Mohammed says we must do, which is redesign the system. Now that's an incredibly big ask, because today it is economic muscle, not military might, that now determines the international balance of power. It's not aircraft carriers and tanks, and armies, the most important instruments of power and influence today are control of market access, control of currencies, investment rules. The Chinese are saying, why do we have to abide by the rules of the internet? Where were they made? Here. Why do we have to abide by the domain names? Why do we have to adhere to these specific set of intellectual property rights? And that's been mirrored elsewhere in the world. Cyberspace espionage is probably the most lethal form of warfare in our age now. It is economic interests that are targeted, the ability to take down markets. Grain, metals, minerals, oil are instruments of foreign policy. We should be wary. We should be alert. We should focus on this stuff. It is quite right that 3 young women march in Jeddah. It is quite right that you demand access for people with wheelchairs. It is quite right that you do the thousands of things you do. Over the next 2 days, you'll meet the people who helped construct the 21st century, the founder of Twitter and all that, and we've seen its power. But its power is entirely reliant on your ability to lead. We've failed. My generation has failed utterly. Muhammad said it, that you have the power to change, but he was echoed millions of years, well, 300 years before that by Thomas Paine, the English radical who wrote The Rights of Man, which was the fuel for the American Revolution. That revolution isn't over. What's happened is that we've all sort of become American revolutionaries, except it's not American any longer. The need to express, the right to determine your own future, and the right to exist can only be done as a species through cooperation. But at the moment, in a world of fragmented systems, the world is very fragile. That's the importance of this meeting. I'll sit down and talk with my guys about transparency. Jamie will talk about a chronic problem that affects our wealth and our poverty. Overeating, no food. Fatima will talk about women. Christine will talk about rights. Too many little silos. They're expert. He'll talk about banking, critical. Another silo, though. Unless you guys can somehow work out a kind of hive system where each cell, each expertise is noted and related to the next. Unless you can find a way of taking the cumulative intellectual power and optimism of your age alongside the greatest feature of our time, lack of leadership, and give that to your people as a service, then things get done. I know you're extremely limited by the fact that you exist in Mauritania or the Comoros or the United Kingdom, by your individuality. What can one person do? Well, dude, you're here because you wanted to be here. You made the essential individual choice that you would gather enough people about you to inject you into this critically important symposium. You do have your own group that you can activate. And I'd like to see something personally over the next year that goes beyond the silo nature of what we talk about into the macro problem. You're not going to be able to solve it, but it is your responsibility. It's coming down the track at you. Some of you have kids already. Some of you will have them. But either which way, you are going to have to make your way in a world that, to me, has never been more dangerous. And most of us here lived through what we thought was the most terrifying period the world had ever seen. Lots of things will get better. Bill's worldview about how individual countries could solve this, that, and the other, yes, we know it can be done. But while there's regional competition, without any sense of global responsibility or leadership, in a world that is entirely linked through a sort of electric membrane, an alternative global nervous system which we've created, then it's possible, if not as extreme as redesigning the system, it's possible to make it less unstable, less unequal, less unsustainable. Even that less is a great challenge. So last year I said, let's go to work. I was asking them, who was Cassandra? Cassandra was this classical figure from Western culture. I don't know if Greek or Roman, probably Greek. And he or she constantly was the doom monger, saying everything's fuck, everything's going to hell, you know. Well, we're here, 2,000 years later. Cassandra was wrong. There's also the folk tale from our part of the world of the boy who cried wolf. Cried wolf 1 or 2 times to get attention from the village, and then one day the wolf showed up, and he cried wolf, and nobody paid him any attention. I'm the boy crying wolf. We'll survive because we are the most brilliant of creatures, there's no question. We hide in plain sight our brilliance. We see the beauty of nature and those wonderful animals, but dude, we can do all of that, you know. We can do all that whale stuff, we can do all that dolphin stuff, we're cool with that. We can also peer back to the beginning of time. We can do all sorts of things. We probably won't solve ourselves. We can have a very good try at doing it. Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man. It is in our power to make the world anew. It's not in my power anymore. It is in yours. Go ahead and do it.